Some might say we're already in the feminist future, in which case, obviously, there are no obstacles to it. For those who think we're still some way off, and I'm one of them, this is a lecture about the remaining obstacles. In the first part of the lecture, I'll name 9 obstacles that plausibly pose a significant challenge to feminism at this time. And in the second and third parts of the lecture, I'll say much more about one of these obstacles in particular. Part 1. Obstacles. In her 1951 paper, Women as a Minority Group, Helen Hacker was attempting to establish that women are in fact a minority group. She observed that women were quite unlike other minority groups, in the respect that they lacked social contact with one another and had high social contact with the dominant group. She notes that Black people or Jewish people often grew up in Black or Jewish communities, where positive internal conceptions of the group could be built and where they would not be discriminated against as Black or as Jewish. Any negative conceptions of the group coming from outsiders would come up against the group's own positive self-conception. But that was not usually true for women, and Hacker noted women's conceptions of themselves, therefore, spring as much from their intimate relationships with men as with women. Women also tend to live in a way that is integrated with men, living together in families with husbands, fathers, sons, and so on. Because of sexual, romantic, and family relationships, we generally don't see women relegated to ghettos relative to men, where we have seen such ghettoization with class, race, and religion. That women are dispersed among men in this way creates a unique challenge to women creating a positive self-conception as a group, strong enough to withstand men's ideas about women. And it creates a challenge to women's solidarity with other women, with love and family ties to men, making it much more difficult for women to choose other women in cases of conflict. This Netflix show does a nice job of dramatizing the matter of a woman's divided loyalties between friends and family on the one hand and other women on the other. Unresolved question of when feminism will be finished. One problem with law and policy measures aimed at achieving equality for disadvantaged groups is that they don't always build in mechanisms for when to stop. Intuitively, of course, we should stop when equality is achieved, but in practice, a service set up for one group in particular can go on long after that point, just as a matter of institutional inertia or because it's hard to get law changed. This is one of the points I took from Jacinta Price's memoir, discussing, among other things, her reasons for opposing the Indigenous voice to Parliament in Australia. It is true now that there is inequality, but dedicated representation in federal law may initially compensate for undeserved disadvantage and later confer undeserved advantage, and the latter creates inequality in the other direction, which will breed resentment and fuel social conflict. This same prospect faces feminism. It needs clarity about its end goal so that there is transparency in when that goal has been accomplished. Without such clarity and transparency, it's easy for ideological opponents to suggest that feminists are using alleged disadvantage as cover while getting ever ahead of men. But feminists can't offer clarity and transparency about feminism's end goal without resolving the sameness-difference question. Or at least, at best, sameness feminists and difference feminists can offer two different answers and leave it with their audience whether to accept that women are still on the worse-off side of an inequality. Which takes us to the sameness-difference question. In Lecture 10, we talked about the widespread belief that men and women are different, and the way that this belief is not actually supported by the empirical evidence, which shows that for any characteristic you might be interested in, most men and women are the same, not different. That is, there are some small differences in the overall distribution for men and women at the population level, but most individual men and individual women fall within the same range, not a different one. Still, until this matter is settled decisively, or until word gets around that it is already settled decisively, the question of sameness and difference will remain an obstacle to the feminist future. For what we should expect a good society to look like is different in the case that men and women are different than it is in the case that men and women are the same. The sameness society has more women on the front lines and more fathers as primary or equal carers, for example. The different society doesn't waste money on costly DEI programs to get more women into industries they have no aptitude for or interest in. This issue will continue to divide feminists because it leads to diverging evaluations of what is in women's interests, and so what feminists should be fighting for. Current backlash against identity politics. The current backlash against the left includes a backlash against identity politics. For example, here's a recent short from the Quillette founder Claire Lehman, which describes oppressed-oppressor binaries as part of critical race theory, and so as part of what we must throw out as we reject critical race theory. This affects feminism, which is widely practiced as a form of identity politics. But the excesses of left-wing politics don't necessarily show that the underlying theory is false or useless. It is unhelpful to carve the world up into oppressed versus oppressor and think that's the end of the story, as if knowing someone's race or sex tells you everything you need to know about them. But it's not necessarily unhelpful, or at least I don't think so, to consider what a useful definition of oppression might be and whether it applies to some social groups today, as we did in Lecture 1, or to think about between group antagonisms like man, woman, rich, poor, white, black, while recognizing that there are many such antagonisms operating at once and that they're only part of any picture and might not even be an important part. For example, someone allegedly an oppressor living in a war zone may be much worse off than someone allegedly oppressed living in a country at peace. Feminists who think the backlash against the left is deserved face the challenge of either finding a way to practice feminism not as identity politics, or of explaining why feminist identity politics are justifiable while other forms of identity politics are not, or explaining the ways in which they went too far but could be limited to become justifiable again. Conflation of feminism with leftism. I won't say much about this one because it was the subject of my last book, and anyone who's interested can read that, or the faster version, listen to one of the interviews where I discuss it. But I'll just briefly note here that there has been a tendency for left-wing women to assume that feminism is part of the broader left-wing project, and so to practice feminist politics in a way that assumes leftist commitments, and in so doing alienates centrist and right-wing women, as well as political spectrum unaffiliated women. In recent years, there has been great controversy over whether feminists should work with the right, a question which itself carries the presumption that feminists are the left deciding whether to work with the right or not. This leads to apparent conflicts within feminism that are really left-right conflicts and have no place there, and to a distorted sense of what feminism's projects and priorities are. The transformation of feminism from a project by women, about women, for women, to a project by anyone, about everyone, by everyone, is almost certainly the result of a conflation of feminism with leftism, and so the rolling of women's liberation together into the broader global justice project. Conflation of the moral with the political. This obstacle is wider than feminism, but affects feminism. The distinction between the moral and the political has been lost. We used to know that choosing not to have meat for dinner was a personal or moral action, and going undercover at an abattoir to film the abuse of animals was a political action. Now everything is confused as political, such that people perform purely personal or moral or expressive or symbolic actions while thinking of themselves as doing politics. This, what we might call lifestyle politics, is an obstacle to feminism because the actions may scratch the itch on a sense of moral indignation about injustices relating to sex without actually achieving anything at all at the level of society. Femininity. I already mentioned difference thinking as an obstacle to the feminist future, But I want to list femininity separately because the obstacle I have in mind is women's collusion with the idea that they are different. When we conform to feminine beauty practices, for example, we make ourselves look and sound and smell different to men, as we discussed in Lecture 5. We cannot keep making ourselves different and insisting that we are the same. We should not collude in men's ideas about what we are like. The reason this remains an obstacle rather than something feminists can easily solve has at least 3 explanations, and probably more. 1, there is a collective action problem in stopping, because it is rational for each individual woman to reap the benefits of conformity to feminine norms while free-riding on other women's efforts to challenge the norms. Individual benefits of conformity might come in the form of attracting a man, doing better in the workplace, having more social success, and so on. But of course, if every woman does this, no woman challenges the norms and everything goes on as it was. 2, stopping can actually disrupt female solidarity, including specifically feminist solidarity, because it suggests a disapproval of other women, even if not stated explicitly. And it opts out of things that women do together and that can be fun. Think going shopping for clothes, going for a pedicure, having a drink together and doing your makeup before going out. Feminism has rarely succeeded where it is anti-fun. 3, relating to the sameness-difference obstacle, many women believe in difference and so consider their femininity as an expression of their authentic selves, rather than a potentially damaging cultural construction that they might work to deconstruct. Many trans women defend femininity in this same way, as something like an innate feature of the self, where they have atypically as males what is had typically by females. The more we think this way, the more implausible dissolving difference will seem. I will just say as a side note here, because it's such a common misconception, that unmaking difference means making the sexes more similar, not eliminating whatever was the feature of one sex but not the other. So gender abolitionism, in the sense at issue here, does not entail abolishing femininity. Rather, it entails decoupling femininity from sex. We might achieve that through more women being less feminine, but alternatively, we might achieve it by more men being more feminine. And that might make us feel a little more optimistic about the feminist future, given the extent to which that is already happening. By which I mean left-wing men and their nail polish, not men claiming to be women. Not all men. The usual feminist objection to not all men is that it's a conversation hijacker, where women are trying to talk about women's situation and say something, for example, about men and rape, and instead of talking about the rape, the man interrupts to impose precision about the men. Not all men rape. But I have in mind something different in listing this as an obstacle. That getting people to really take between-group antagonism seriously is difficult to the extent that something is described as man-woman that is really something like 1% of men, 5% of women. Just as it might raise the hackles of the white anti-racist to hear about whites lynching blacks, as though this was a thing that white people generally did, it can raise the hackles of the male feminist or male anti-sexist to hear about men raping women. This is also tied up with the first obstacle of women being an atypical minority group, because women's loyalties to the men they are in relationships and families with will get in the way of their seeing and wanting to see men as in any sense the enemy. If the proportion of men who are a problem is small enough, it might be better to talk about the specific features of those implicated, rather than cast the problem as a grand battle of the sexes. For example, everybody, as Bell Hooks advocates for, versus toxic masculinity. The final obstacle I'll mention, although this list is not exhaustive, is pornography and prostitution. In the Orthodoxies of Mainstream Feminism segment of this course, we covered white feminism and trans inclusion, where we could easily have covered the orthodoxy that sex work is work. In the Applied Topics segment of the course, we covered femininity, abortion, and intercourse, where we could easily have covered prostitution, pornography, and surrogacy. A society that has prostitution is one in which the right to sex for men is upheld through commercial institutions. A society that has pornography, or at least violent and degrading pornography, is one in which the alleged attempt to secure women's equality is constantly confounded by cultural messaging about what a woman is really for. It is very hard to see how any future in which women are considered full persons of equal worth to men is possible with these two institutions remaining in place. In the rest of this lecture, I'm going to focus on this last obstacle, a good candidate for being the most significant. In part 2, I'll introduce one way of thinking about whether sex should be for sale. In part 2, we'll talk about pornography as a kind of propaganda against women. Part 2, Noxious Markets. In her 2010 book, Why Some Things Should Not Be for Sale, Deborah Satz takes up the question of whether everything should be for sale or there should be some limits. Chapter 4, Noxious Markets, discusses noxious markets in general. Chapter 6 turns to markets in sex in particular. In Chapter 4, she gives 4 parameters for differentiating noxious markets from other kinds of markets. This is not an attack on markets in general, but a criticism at the margins of markets in things like human body parts, child labor, toxic waste, sex, and life-saving medicines, some of the most controversial goods when it comes to commodification. A background idea here is the egalitarian one that says that markets corrupt the nature of certain goods, trading in things that money should not buy. Satz's theory of markets takes into account the way that markets shape people's relationships, which is more than a question merely of externalities, harms that are not factored into prices. She writes, "A market exchange based in desperation, humiliation, or begging, or whose terms of remediation involve bondage or servitude, is not an exchange between equals. On my view, lurking behind many, if not all, noxious markets are problems relating to the standing of the parties before, during, and after the process of exchange." She defends the idea that some markets should be prohibited, or at least severely constrained. Here are the parameters for identifying noxious markets: harmful outcomes for individuals, harmful outcomes for society, weak or asymmetric knowledge and/or agency, and extreme vulnerability. Let's start with harmful outcomes for individuals. Some markets produce outcomes that are harmful for those who participate in the market or for third parties. This includes markets that leave people destitute, for example, a grain market whose price is so high that it leaves some people starving, and markets that compromise our most basic interests in agency and well-being, understood as a minimal level for an adequate and minimally decent life. Harmful outcomes for society. Some markets undermine the social framework needed for people to interact as equals. This will include markets that undermine people's capacities to exercise their rights or participate in society, including child labor and bonded labor markets, and markets that condition people to be docile, servile, or passive toward the status quo. Satz also includes interaction as democratic equals here, which means a market in votes will also count as noxious. And just note then that harmful outcomes for society has a technical meaning. It doesn't just mean lots of individuals in society are harmed. That would be subsumed under the first category, harmful outcomes for individuals. These first 2 parameters were about the consequences or outcomes of markets. The next 2 are about the underlying conditions of the markets: weak or asymmetric knowledge and/or agency. People interacting in markets can have a lack of information or evidence about what they are in fact doing or agreeing to the point that one party is in complete ignorance. Satz says that this is particularly the case in transactions with a long time period, where you can change how you feel between the point of the transaction being initiated, for example, signing a contract, and the point of the transaction being completed. Her example is surrogacy, selling your ability to have a child. If you've never been pregnant before, then your knowledge may be too weak for you to make a fully informed decision about what you're happy to do. And this may make a market in surrogacy a noxious one. This is why some states make surrogacy legal only for women who have had children before. We might also worry in this category about markets involving young children who can't make fully autonomous decisions yet. Markets that are very one-sided, for example in politics, and markets based on deception, even where this doesn't lead to harm. Those examples were mostly about weak or asymmetric knowledge. The other part of this parameter was weak agency. We might worry about compromised agency in cases involving third parties, for example in child labor cases where it's parents who are making transactions that affect the child. Pimping and trafficking are like this too. And finally, extreme vulnerability. Some markets involve the extreme vulnerability of one party to the transaction. People coming together with very unequal sets of resources and needs may create a situation where one can be easily exploited. Desperate people are likely to agree to any terms. Here are some examples of markets that meet multiple of Satz's parameters. Blood diamonds fund brutal civil wars. This means the market has extremely harmful outcomes for individuals, and it also involves compromised agency for those affected by the markets through the war. But this is not about the social meaning of diamonds or the unequal social standing of the traders. So we'd have 2 out of the 4 conditions. Markets in kidneys, for example, involve extreme vulnerability of those selling their body parts, harmful outcomes for the individuals who sell them, compromised knowledge, for example, about health risks, and unequal standing between the transactors, the rich who can afford to buy them and the poor who are desperate enough to sell them. So we have all 4 conditions met. Satz seems to think that meeting any one of these conditions suffices to make a market noxious, and the more conditions that are met, the more noxious it is. She acknowledges toward the end of the chapter that she doesn't provide a precise view of how bad a market has to be in order to count as meeting one of these conditions. For example, what if there's some weak knowledge, but it isn't that important because the thing to be known about doesn't have very dramatic effects? She finishes the chapter by emphasizing that even when we clearly have a noxious market, it's not clear whether we should ban it or merely restrict it. Banning can be worse for the values that we're aiming to protect, depending on what will happen once we've banned it. For example, black markets springing up. This is relevant to both prostitution and commercial surrogacy. If our motivation to ban the industries is to promote women's equality, and banning the markets would actually lead to less equality for women via more harm to women in black market conditions, then banning is not the approach we should take. Our moral assessment of the market is one question, our policy solution to the market is another. In Chapter 6, Markets in Women's Sexual Labor, Satz turns to the specific question of a market in sexual intercourse and other sexual acts, namely prostitution. In Chapter 6, she surveys 2 standard ways that markets in prostitution have been addressed, criticizing both and offering a third approach. The first standard approach has been economic. The economic approach doesn't have any value commitments about the sale of sex being wrong. In fact, it doesn't have any value commitments about the sale in anything being wrong. It just looks at the costs and benefits that flow from a market in a thing. On this approach, we just need to ask about the costs and benefits of prostitution as a market. These might include costs of disease and guilt, diversion of financial resources, for example, the man in the family spending money on sex that could be spent on his children, costs to family stability in terms of trust when infidelity is discovered, and the number of people who find the industry morally offensive and have a preference that it didn't exist. Satz says the economic approach falls short because it doesn't consider the background conditions in which prostitution occurs, most importantly the fact that some women do it only in order not to starve, because it can't take any moral distinctions into account. Slavery seems to be wrong whether or not the costs and benefits story tells us that, and whether or not people in fact have moral preferences against it, which they haven't always had. And it can't account for the special status of some goods given their roles in other important systems. For example, that we shouldn't have a market in votes because one person, one vote as an idea is crucial to democracy and political equality, allowing people to interact as equals. The other standard approach is referred to as the essentialist approach, which is the idea that there is something intrinsic to sex that makes it different from the other kinds of things that might appropriately be bought or sold. That means we can say it's not about what harm is caused by there being a market in it, but that selling it altogether is a harm because of the kind of thing that it is. The Swedish radical feminist Kajsa Ekman has argued that there is no separating the self from the body, so that selling the use of the body is selling the self. And this is fundamentally harmful to human dignity. One criticism of the essentialist approach comes from liberalism, which says individual sovereignty over mind and body is crucial for the exercise of fundamental liberties. These liberties are limited for liberals only by the harm principle, which says that people should be free to pursue their own good in their own way, compatible with like freedom for all. And such pursuit is incompatible with like freedom for all if it causes harm to others. For example, if you decide your liberty involved putting your cigarettes out on me, the liberal can condemn your actions because they harm me and limit my pursuit of my conception of the good. Applied to prostitution, this would mean that unless we can show clear harms, we have no grounds for banning people's choices to buy and sell the use of each other's bodies. Some transactions involving bodies can be shown to be harmful in this way, such as the sale of organs and other body parts. The question is whether prostitution is the same. Satz says she's not convinced it is. There is no strong evidence that prostitution is, at least in the United States and certainly among its higher echelons, a more desperate exchange than, say, working in Walmart. This may sound obtuse. Why focus on the higher echelons in a rich country when there is so much prostitution going on among people in poor countries, and often by wealthy tourists and soldiers, and among the lower echelons of a rich society, for example, women selling sex on the street or in brothels. But Satz's point is that women have such different attitudes to sex that it may be comparable to Walmart for at least some people. She writes, "This may reflect the fact that the relationship people have with their sexual capacities is diverse. For some people, sexuality is a realm of ecstatic communion with another. For others, it is little more than a sport or distraction. Some people will find consenting to be sexually used by another person enjoyable or adequately compensated by a wage. Even for the same person, sex can be a source of a range of experiences." Satz takes this approach deliberately to avoid paternalism, which means telling women what is good for them or telling them that they are mistaken when they think they want particular things or are okay with particular things. This is a common objection against those who wish to ban prostitution, that they have to tell the women who do it or would do it that they are making a mistake, and this looks paternalistic and condescending. So, if neither the economic approach nor the essentialist approach get things right, what is the right approach to a market in prostitution? Satz argues in a third way. There is social harm in that having a market of commercialized sex sustains a world in which women as a social group are subordinated. The harms of prostitution are to a class, namely women. On Satz's view, contemporary prostitution degrades women by treating them as the sexual servants of men. Currently, prostitutes are overwhelmingly women, and their clients are almost exclusively men. In conceiving of a class of women as needed to satisfy male sexual desire, prostitution represents women as sexual servants to men. This is an egalitarian objection to a market in prostitution. The background is one of sex inequality. Women are an economically and socially disadvantaged group in terms of income, poverty, unequal division of labor in the family, being subject to negative stereotyping, social hierarchy, violence by men, other sorts of social sanctions, marginalization, and stigma. For example, it being harder to get rape prosecuted because of the social perception that women really want to be forced into sex. So her conclusion is that if prostitution is wrong, That's because it has effects on how men perceive all women and how women perceive themselves. The existence of the highly asymmetric industry, men buying sex from women, also helps to perpetuate the idea that the male sex drive is insatiable and requires access to women's bodies. Satz says prostitution is a theatre of inequality. Her position has the interesting implication that prostitution is not necessarily wrong, not intrinsically or essentially wrong, but only contingently wrong, because of those background facts about sex subordination. If we didn't live in a patriarchy, maybe things would be different. And that means that one day, thousands of years into the future perhaps, markets in sex might be perfectly fine, because then there is no background fact of sex inequality. She comments in the chapter that we need more empirical work on the connection between men using prostitutes and their more general treatment of women. It's noteworthy that most of the existing empirical work focuses on the women who sell sex, not on the men who buy it, which positions prostitution as a problem about women rather than a problem about men. This all suggests that feminists who focus on the positive potential of prostitution, for example for empowerment or agency, are not taking seriously enough the background conditions of sex inequality. They are arguing from what would be positive in a utopia to what is in fact positive now in very much not a utopia. Satz writes, I think that these feminists have minimized the cultural stereotypes that surround contemporary prostitution and exaggerated their own power to shape the practice. She thinks the thing to focus on going forward is models of egalitarian relations between men and women. Satz focused on her condition harmful outcomes for society in arguing against markets in prostitution. And she makes the same case against surrogacy in Chapter 5, saying that markets in reproductive labor reinforce gender hierarchies in a way that other markets don't. But we might also want to see how far we can get with the other conditions for noxious markets, to strengthen the case that prostitution is a noxious market in her terms. So let's briefly consider the other three conditions: harmful outcomes for individuals, weak or asymmetric knowledge or agency, and extreme vulnerability. Starting with harmful outcomes for individuals. If there's more demand for prostitution than there are women willing to meet it, then there's a risk that this leads to trafficking, the abduction of women and coercion of them into sex work. Data from 155 countries gathered in 2006 for the United Nations Global Report on Trafficking in Persons showed that 79% of trafficking was for sexual exploitation, and 79% of the victims were female, 66% were women, and a further 13% were girls. The prostitution industry is estimated to involve between 40 to 42 million people, and estimates of the proportion of these people who have been trafficked are between 14% at the low end and 60 to 90% at the high end. Trafficking then is not a marginal problem when it comes to prostitution, although some feminists, for obvious reasons, maintain that they are against trafficking but for prostitution, that they can be separated. I'll talk next about some research on women in sex work. It shows extreme vulnerability in the women who men are buying the use of when they buy sex. If some or all of this vulnerability was there before sex work, then it falls under Satz's condition extreme vulnerability, the conditions in which the market operates. If, on the other hand, some or all of the vulnerability is caused by sex work, then it's harmful outcomes for individuals. These are outcomes or consequences of the market. It might also be both. Someone who has experienced childhood sexual abuse, run away and become homeless, and then entered street prostitution to stay alive has extreme vulnerability and is at risk of being exploited by predatory pimps or madams, but it is common to develop drug and alcohol addictions while in prostitution as a coping strategy. And the repeated sexual use and the damage the drugs and or alcohol are doing are both harmful outcomes for individuals. Extreme vulnerability. A study from Baltimore, Maryland between 2016 and 2017 found that 61% of female sex workers screened positive for PTSD symptoms, post-traumatic stress disorder, and that these sex workers had extensive histories of sexual and physical violence, with 81.8% having experienced some sexual and physical violence in their lifetimes, 15.5% having experienced childhood or adult sexual re-victimization, and 37.7% having experienced childhood or adult physical re-victimization. The researchers found that the levels of PTSD observed among our sample were comparable with that reported among treatment-seeking war veterans. A recent meta-analysis on 55 studies of female sex workers found the overall prevalence of suicide ideation to be 27%, suicide attempts to be 20%, depression to be 44%, and PTSD to be 29%. The researchers sum things up this way. FSW, female sex workers, are an extremely vulnerable group susceptible to intense psychological stress derived from multiple health, social, economic, and legal barriers, where the exposure to different types of violence during their lifetime also plays a key role in the psychopathology of mental health disorders. They go on, when comparing them to other similarly vulnerable populations, especially considering trauma-exposed populations, proportions of depression and PTSD are still higher among the FSW. And weak or asymmetric knowledge or agency. This is going to be at its most dramatic in the cases of trafficking and other types of coerced prostitution. For example, wives and girlfriends pimped out by their partners as part of ongoing domestic abuse. And a part of pimping more generally, which usually, sometimes, often, I'm not sure, does not involve a fair exchange of protection in return for a percentage of earnings, but rather confiscates and controls all earnings. There might be weak knowledge when women and girls first get into prostitution and don't realize that it can be extremely hard to get out again. First, because sex work is still stigmatized, and this means there will be an inexplicable gap on their CV. Second, because they may develop addictions that make it hard to hold down stable work after a period in prostitution. Thus, like markets in kidneys, prostitution looks like a market that meets all four conditions. Although, unlike markets in kidneys, there are not the good cases to operate as social cover for the bad ones. Part 3. What pornography says about women. Group defamation was a legal offense in Massachusetts at the time Catharine, MacKinnon, and Andrea Dworkin were campaigning for their draft ordinance against pornography. Here's the relevant part of the state's law. Whoever publishes any false written or printed materials with intent to maliciously promote hatred of any group of persons in the Commonwealth because of race, color, or religion shall be guilty of libel, and shall be punished by a fine of not more than $1,000 or by imprisonment for not more than 1 year or both. The defendant may prove in defense that the publication was privileged or was not malicious. MacKinnon suggests that people take group defamation more seriously when there have been historical atrocities against the groups in question. As she puts it, real atrocities provide the vocabulary of experience that animates the concept of group defamation. And some of the situations referred to are real to people and some are not. She lists the Holocaust against Jews, the genocide of Native Americans, slavery and segregation for African Americans and Black South Africans, and the atomic bombing of Japan during World War II as comparatively more real atrocities. Some types of speech can keep their specific traumas alive, as well as reinscribe and revivify a prejudice that did not begin or end with them. We take seriously, at least in those cases, that words can do things. They can animate and actualize particular ideas and attitudes about groups. They can justify and legitimate violence. She writes that words are understood to construct social reality. This means by speaking in a certain way about groups, we make the social world a certain way. By talking about Jews as inferior, we create a world in which Jews are inferior, and that legitimizes violence and other forms of mistreatment against them, and so too for other groups. The causation here is not direct and not necessary. It is something like words can create prejudice. Prejudice can be the basis of mistreatment. If we cared only about the mistreatment, then we'd want to hear a lot more about this chain of causation. When are words likely to create prejudice rather than to be ignored? When is prejudice the basis of mistreatment? How risky is prejudice? Risky enough to justify the suppression of certain speech or to target those ideas at their source in an attempt to stamp them out entirely? MacKinnon notes that not even for the most dramatic historical atrocities do people necessarily think of speaking in certain ways about groups as dangerous. There's a sense of these things being in the past, as being essentially over, and living on mainly as analogy or memory. She applies this idea of group defamation, which in the Massachusetts law protected only race, color, or religion, to women and pornography. Here and now, there is something virtually never included in the lexicon of group defamation. People are being callously dehumanized, horribly brutalized, and sometimes killed. Verbal, visual, and physical atrocities are committed, demeaning an entire group because of a condition of birth, targeting them for physical atrocities which are being done. This case is distinctive in a number of ways, including the fact that a lot of money is being made from the defamatory materials, and that the connections between the material and specific physical abuses are far better documented than in any other instance. Yet the atrocity is not acknowledged, but is widely denied. Its ideas are neither widely identified as false nor generally condemned. On the contrary, the materials are rather widely celebrated, alternately defended as freedom itself and as the price we must pay for freedom. Not only is this permitted to happen, it is defended by many as a measure of principle. MacKinnon notes that because many people deny that there is a condition of women, it is much harder for them to recognize that pornography could be one of the things contributing to the condition of women. But her view, of course, was that there is such a condition. In reality, the status and treatment of women has certain regularities across time and space, making gender a group experience of inequality on the basis of sex. She sees women's condition in the way discussed earlier in the course under the heading of the sex-gender distinction. The level of victimization of women varies within and across cultures. In the contemporary United States, for example, women of color are hardest hit. But no woman is exempt from this condition from the moment of her birth to the moment of her death, in the eyes of the law or in the memory of her children. This condition is imposed by force. Some force comes in the more covert forms of socialization, pressure, and inculcation to passivity and femininity, some in the more overt forms of poverty and sexual violence. Okay, now we just need the connection to pornography. MacKinnon writes, pornography has a central role in actualizing this system of subordination in the contemporary West, beginning with the conditions of its production. In all pornography, women are prostituted. This is done because it means sexual pleasure to pornography's consumers and profits to its providers, largely organized crime. To those who are exploited, it means being bound, battered, tortured, harassed, raped, and sometimes killed, or merely humiliated, molested, objectified, and used. It is done because someone who has more power than they do, someone who matters, someone with rights, a full human being and a full citizen, gets pleasure from seeing it, or doing it, or seeing it as a form of doing it. In order to produce what the consumer wants to see, it must first be done to someone, usually a woman with few real choices. Because he wants to see it done, it is done to her. There are a number of points here. First, pornography is not just an idea. What is done in pornography is really being done to an actual woman. Second, there is inequality. The woman it is being done to has few real choices relative to the men doing it, the men watching it, the men producing it. Third, pornography, both in doing these things to real women and in the messages that are transmitted in this being a mass consumption form of entertainment, contributes to women's subordination most generally. MacKinnon seems to veer in the paper between these two quite different types of harms to women in the making of pornography and from the men who watch and make pornography, many that were testified to during the Minneapolis City Council's hearings on pornography, and harms to women as a class, contributing to women's condition, the latter being the harmful outcomes for society that Satz focused on in arguing against prostitution. What are the harms to the women used in the making of pornography? MacKinnon writes, many in the hearings spoke of the self-revulsion, the erosion of intimacy, the unbearable indignity, the shattered self, and the shame, anger, anguish, outrage, and despair they felt at living in a country where their torture is enjoyed and their screams are heard only as the speech of their abusers. What are the harms to all women of pornography? Here, MacKinnon denies that pornography merely represents an inequality that is going on elsewhere, and insists that pornography is rather an integral dynamic in women's inequality, which is why she and Dworkin cast it in their ordinance as a civil rights violation. She suggests that there is something significant in the fact that men are literally having orgasms to depictions of women's inequality. Through its consumption, it further institutionalizes a subhuman, victimized, second-class status for women by conditioning men's orgasm to sexual inequality. When men use pornography, they experience in their bodies, not just their minds, that one-sided sex, sex between a person, them, and a thing, it, is sex. That sexual use is sex, sexual abuse is sex, sexual domination is sex. This is the sexuality that they then demand, practice, purchase, and live out in their everyday social relations with others. Pornography works by making sexism sexy. And she goes on, power and powerlessness are experienced and inculcated as sexual excitement and release. Inequality between women and men is what is sexy about pornography. The more unequal, the sexier. Pornography makes sexuality into a key dynamic in gender inequality by viscerally defining gender through the experience of hierarchical sexuality. Seen in this way, pornography is at once a concrete practice and an ideological statement. The concrete practices are discriminatory, the ideological statements are defamatory. This needs a bit of unpacking. Let's start with the second sentence. What does it mean to say that sexuality is a key dynamic in gender inequality? When we step back from gender, sex inequality, we just have a fact of inequality with many different aspects. For example, workplace segregation, both across industries and within industry hierarchies. Different feminists will give different explanations of this inequality. As we saw in Lecture 4, MacKinnon's explanation puts sex, as in intercourse, and sexuality in the center of the explanation. She thinks it is because there is social hierarchy in sexuality, with the male as dominant and the female as submissive, and because there is relentless propaganda propping up this social hierarchy, that we have sex hierarchy, as in biological sex, more generally. It's not that because of, for example, the exploitation of domestic labor, that there came to be some inequality in sex also. It's the other way around, according to MacKinnon at least. That's what she means when she says gender is defined through the experience of hierarchical sexuality. To be a man just is to be a creature socially constructed to the eroticization of dominance. And to be a woman just is to be a creature socially constructed to the eroticization of submissiveness. On this view, there's plenty of room to consider submissive gay men, men in prison marked for rape, and transsexual and transgender women as women. And indeed, MacKinnon said in a 2017 paper that she considers raped men to be her sisters. Now to the third sentence. Pornography is at once a concrete practice and an ideological statement. The practice is discriminatory, the statement is defamatory. This makes sense because discrimination is a type of treatment, while defamation is a kind of reputational damage. When I refuse to hire you because you are not racially diverse in the metrics I'm trying to cultivate, I discriminate against you on the grounds of race. I literally prevent you from having something that without my prejudice you would have had. When I defame you, I am creating or spreading negative ideas about you. These may then be acted on as discrimination, but they need not be. Where they are not, we have defamation but not discrimination. So we can say that the harms done to women in the making of pornography and by the men who make and watch pornography, when there is such harm, its extent is empirically contested, that is discrimination. And the harm done to women by the ideology of pornography, which presents women as inferior, as things for men to that is defamation. It is defamation against all women because of what it says about women. In the remainder of the paper, MacKinnon looks further into this initial characterization of pornography as discrimination and defamation, and questions whether the defamation characterization is really capturing what is going on with pornography. She says some of the theory fits, but much of it does not. There is an ideology, she agrees, but this is only one of its effects, and is not the one on which the civil rights approach centrally focuses. This is where the move from what pornography says about women to what pornography does to women comes in. She says there is no analogy for pornography because of the fact that pornography provides direct sexual stimulation, and that is sex, not just ideas about sex. She says its pleasure is a specific reinforcer for bigotry itself, not an argument about why bigotry is right, nor even a base appeal to bigoted interests. Then perhaps her best line in the paper, if you think an orgasm is an argument, try arguing with one sometime. This consideration makes her swing toward discrimination rather than defamation. A sign on a business saying no women does something to any woman who wants to enter, namely discriminates against her. And it says something about all women, namely that they are inferior or despised or do not belong here, as the case may be. But sometimes what might at first look like a mere saying something may actually be a doing something. Sexual harassment is a form of discrimination, and it's achieved through words. So why not also pornography? MacKinnon draws a parallel to lynchings and photographs of lynchings. A lynching is an expression of inequality. She writes, the idea expressed by hanging the body in public is that all blacks belong in a subordinate position and should stay there, or they will be horribly brutalized, maimed, and murdered. Members of the subordinate group see the body and get the message to stay in their place. Members of the dominant group see the body and get the message that they are superior and deserve to live. People will see a photograph of a single individual lynched man as an atrocity against an entire people. MacKinnon notes, I doubt many masturbate to it. Then she asks, if blacks were lynched in order to make photographs of lynchings on a $10 billion a year scale, would that make them protected speech? Given the fact that someone must be lynched to make a picture of a lynching, what is more important, the picture or the person? What would it say about the seriousness with which society regards lynching if lynching were illegal, but pictures of lynching were affirmatively protected and constituted a highly profitable, visible, and pervasive industry, defended as a form of freedom and a constitutional right? And finally, what would it mean if the courts held that because lynching effectively expresses a point of view about African Americans, it is an idea whose mass expression over and over and over again, thousands every year, is protected speech? She is not denying that pornography says something about women. She writes, pornography is propaganda, an expression of male ideology, a hate literature, an argument for sexual fascism. And in this latter claim, she is in agreement with Andrea Dworkin in her 1978 paper, Pornography, the New Terrorism, which I've listed in the video description. But MacKinnon also goes further, saying that defamation is not sufficient. The theory of group defamation does not adequately encompass the reality of pornography. Satz's point about how to deal with prostitution as a noxious market also shows up for pornography. Our moral assessment of the market is one question, our policy solution to the market is another. Even if we are persuaded by these arguments to morally oppose prostitution and pornography, there remains a further question about what law and policy approaches to support. We should not choose a policy approach that will only make things worse for women. Although we perhaps should choose a policy approach that will make things worse in the short term, but much better in the long term, or worse for a smaller group of women, but much better for a larger group, and so on. That brings the philosophy of feminism to a close. Goodbye forever.